Hello, and welcome to the first episode of Device Week, a podcast where editors and reporters from the Gray Sheet talk about stories they're covering with an important impact for the device and diagnostics community. I'm Gray Sheet editor David Fillmore. I'm joined today by reporters Danny Al-Farouk and Sue Darcy, senior editor Reed Miller, and our editor-at-large Sean Schmidt. What we'd like to do in this podcast is give a taste of the issues that are covered in more depth in Gray Sheet articles and multimedia content at thegraysheet.com. This week, we'll hear a few company product updates, details on the device advisory panel reforms, diagnostics news, global harmonization, and some details on our FDA recalls and pre-market decision data. First, let's go to Reed. Reed, you covered a clinical development update in the closely watched field of transcatheter aortic valve replacements. What happened there?
Yeah, St. Jude is developing a transcatheter aortic valve called Portico to compete with what Edwards and Medtronic have. And in September, they had to stop their U.S. trial of the device as well as stop selling it in Europe because they found some images on computerized tomography that suggested that there was a problem with the leaflets getting too thick and then therefore not being as mobile. So they shut down everything for a while to take a look at that. And what they eventually decided was that it was not a problem that was leading to any adverse events in patients, and that it was not a problem that's actually specific to the Portico valve, that it could happen to any valve. So a few months ago, they started selling them again in Europe, and then just this week, FDA gave them the go-ahead to start up their trial again in the U.S. So about 1,000 patients they're working on, hopefully, for this trial, and so they'll be able to start that again right away.
So it's a relatively large trial, so they've restarted it, but it's still some time before it actually finishes.
Right, yeah, they're still way behind Medtronic's core valve and Edwards' Sapien valves. So, but I mean, it's an important market for any cardiovascular device company to get into, and a lot of companies, both the big ones and small ones, are already competing in it in Europe. It's just a slow process to get it into the U.S. because the trials take so long.
Okay, interesting. Thanks. Separately this week, Reed, you wrote about a molecular diagnostics company, I think, with a focus on sepsis. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, so over the last couple of years, there's been an economic opportunity emerging in the U.S. hospital market, at least, to take care of and reduce hospital-acquired infections. And sepsis, which is an inflammatory response of the body to an infection, is a major killer of hospital patients in the U.S., and it's a big problem and a big economic drag, costing about $55 billion a year, according to some estimates. So, unfortunately, though, the test for sepsis right now, it's not very sensitive, and it takes a long time to conduct. So there's a Seattle company called Immune Express that is developing a system that, instead of looking for the specific pathogen in a blood sample, it actually measures using some molecular diagnostic technology, actually looks at the patient's own immune response, and it's a lot faster and can provide what they call usable information to the doctor about a patient's sepsis status within a few hours. It basically just gives a statistical breakdown of what the odds are that the patient has sepsis. So they reached out to me, and we talked to the CEO to find out kind of what their commercial strategy is and sort of how their technology is different, what we can look forward to in that field.
Great. Thanks, Reed. Next, let's move to Sue. Sue, you're continuing to look at the House 21st Century Cures legislative reform effort. That's something we've been digging into for months. And this week you explored specifically the provision in the bill seeking to reform the device advisory panel process. Can you tell us about that?
Sure, Dave. This week I got some reaction from industry attorneys and a policy expert on public health matters on how the Cures bill provision would change the membership of these panels and the process for holding them. The provision says that the panels, which include both permanent and temporary voting members who advise FDA on the safety and effectiveness of products, should always include at least 2 clinicians with very specific expertise in the medical specialty field of the product being reviewed, and at least 1 technical expert in the technology of the device. Of course, this sounds harmless enough, but the provision would also give product sponsors an additional period of time at these tightly scheduled meetings to make rebuttals against any misstatements of fact heard at the meetings and to ask additional questions. But agency reviewers would not be permitted the same privilege, And a public health interest person who I spoke to told me that she believes that there isn't enough adequate time for public health interests to be heard also. The upshot of my interviews on this topic is that the provision is likely to trigger more conflict of interest waivers that FDA will have to grant and could lengthen the time for the product review and also the length of the meeting.
Thanks, Sue. And I think as the provisions you're talking about definitely linked to companies' interest in expanding their influence and control on the panel process to some extent. Although in my own reporting, I found that in a lot of cases, I think companies would be happy to skip the panel process outright, since the AdCom meeting planning and everything takes up a lot of valuable time and basically guarantees a delay in getting to the market. So I've recently found out and also wrote about issue related to the advisory panel process, where FDA is working on a new guidance to lay out the basic criteria for determining when a panel meeting is necessary and when it isn't. So there's a lot of industries looking closely at that effort and hoping that the guidance will make the process a little bit more predictable and only lead to panels when they're truly necessary. So we'll keep an eye out for that and see how FDA's efforts there align with what's going on with the Cures Act.
As well as the progress of the Cures bill itself. It still has to go through full House confirmation, and we have yet to see anything from the Senate.
Right. Good point. It's a moving process, without a doubt. Switching gears, HHS is moving forward with a $20 million competition to develop rapid point-of-care diagnostic tests that can be used to detect antibiotic-resistant strains of bacteria. Danny, you covered that. What's happened there?
So yeah, as we've reported before, the government has been very concerned with the rise in drug-resistant infections. And in the past, CDC's Tom Frieden has said that we're entering this era of post-antibiotic, treatments. And actually this week at the White House, Secretary Sylvia Burwell said that not only are we approaching that era, we might have actually gotten into it. So they're hoping that this competition that they're sponsoring through the NIH and BARDA will spur development of tests that can help healthcare professionals identify drug-resistant bacteria, but also help researchers develop new drugs for those kinds of infections. And at this stage, what they're doing is they're asking what kinds of criteria they should use when evaluating candidates, and the public has until July 17th to submit the recommendations.
Okay, so there's no actual ability to apply for this competition as of yet. They're still sort of getting it set to go.
Yeah, they're just looking for the criteria, and in their proposal, they mention a number of bacteria that they've prioritized, but they're also asking, are there other bacteria we need to look at that we need diagnostics for? And in particular, these are rapid diagnostics tests that they want, so that they can get treatments to patients early on and more effectively. They've also got a number of criteria that they list themselves that they might want to look at, but again, they're asking the public what kind of aspects of those criteria they should be looking at, or if there are other criteria they need to be looking at as well.
Okay, thanks, Danny. I think separately this week you were looking at a global regulatory convergence issue. Particularly U.S. and Canada have signaled some updated plans on guidance development related to the medical device single audit program. Can you give us a feel for what you've learned there?
Sure. Yeah. And it was, at the end of last month, actually, at the very end of last month, the Department of Commerce released these work plans that would help the FDA and Canadian health regulators converge how they conduct audits. And they said they intend to release 2 draft guidances on how the regulatory agencies can use the same audit reports to gather information and how they will conduct their audits to ensure consistency sometime this month. As we reported also in the past, they've been working on this for a while now to try to make sure that the various devices developed by companies applying in the U.S. and Canada, and also outside of these areas, there are other countries that are part of this, that they might be able to converge all their auditing requirements. And they eventually hope to have a final guidance in place, final guidances actually, in place by the end of 2016, based on those drafts that they hope to release at sometime this month.
Thanks, Danny. Great. Now let's turn to every company's favorite topic, device recalls. Sean, you've been digging, as you do every year, into annual recall trends in the device industry. And you're ready, I think, to post some data and analysis in the next few days. What can we expect?
Well, Dave, it should come as no surprise that the medical device industry chalked up the most product recalls ever in calendar year 2014. Now, this comes from my analysis of 1,186 recalls that were initiated by device firms between January 1st and December 31st of last year. Now, that's a modest increase of 4% over the previous all-time high of 1,146 device recalls that were reported in 2013. But on the bright side, there were fewer high-risk Class 1 recalls initiated by manufacturers in 2014. So that's some good news there. So subscribers will definitely want to check out the full analysis Monday, June 8th at thegreatsheet.com. Back to you, Dave.
Great. Thanks, Sean. Definitely something to look out for. Also on the data front, before we go, I wanted to highlight our recently launched FDA decision data section on our website, which are basically enhanced searchable, sortable tables of 2015, FDA PMA, supplement, 510K, and de novo approval data. We're using them to support some of our own analysis of FDA review trends, and hopefully they're helpful for your own analysis as well. This week I did a tally of companies that have received the most 510K clearances this year so far. So you can go to thegreatsheet.com to check out the details on that. And there are more details on all the topics we spoke about today and a range of other issues at our site, which is again, thegreatsheet.com. You can also follow us on Twitter @Greysheet. For now, thanks for listening.